Okay. Gerhard, if you don't mind.
Yes, it's just few words because people are here to listen to Gerhard. It's a very big pleasure to have Gerhard from the University of Tübingen. So as I was saying, everybody was asking how is game theory connected to linguistics. So today is the right time to get the answer. So Gerhard, if you want, please, your floor is yours.
Thank you.
We are very glad that you have accepted our invitation. And please, if you want to start.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Actually, I already told Dimitrios, so I had my game theory phase like between 2000 and 2010 as a postdoc, mostly a young professor, and then I moved on, but I still like this, and you know the work is still around, and actually it has been developed further by other people in the meantime. So this is an active branch of research in linguistics these days. Also, I should mention my colleague Michael Flanker. So what I'm going to present, so Michael and me, we came across this idea around the same time, not knowing about each other then, and then at some point we joined forces, and he wrote his thesis about this, and mostly the final version is actually more Michael's than my own, but yeah, it's pretty much joint work. Before I go into the details of this iterated best response model, so several of you asked, so how is linguistics related to game theory? So let's set the big picture a bit, perhaps. So game theory, as you all know, is a mathematical framework to describe strategic situations. So you have several agents. Agents can make decisions, and agents have preferences, and the preferences are between action profiles. So whether or not I get a preferred outcome depends not just on what I do, but what everybody else does in principle. And of course, this is something which is relevant for economics, because you know, if you want to sell something and you set the price too high, then you might not be able to sell it. And yeah, you know all this. So obviously, economic interaction is strategic, but many more scenarios in social interaction have this strategic aspect. So if you drive on the left or on the right, it's a standard example. So most people probably don't have a real preference per se, but if everybody else drives on the right, then it's just better to also drive on the right. And this is typical of convention. There was a very influential book, it was actually a thesis from 1969 by the philosopher David Lewis. It was called Convention. And he made the case that the notion of a Nash equilibrium from game theory is extremely helpful to understand the nature of conventions. So a convention is something like a rule or a propensity of acting in a certain way in society, which is self-reinforcing.
May I interrupt?
Yes.
We are still seeing slide number 0, I guess, the title.
Yeah. So I'm still setting.
Okay, fine.
And I will. I don't have slides about this general philosophical introduction. So Lewis' point was, so let's go back to this example with driving. So driving on the right is self-reinforcing. Because if you want to avoid a crash, then it's just better to drive on the right if everybody else does. If everybody else drives on the left, then you are well advised in your own good interest to also drive on the left. And according to Lewis, so this is characteristic of social conventions. And language is a social convention. So there's, in the philosophy of language, there is this old problem of, well, how can rules of a language, so the vocabulary and the grammar, how can this be established in the first place? So it seems like it is based on a tacit agreement. So we all speak English, and we all know certain amount of English words and English grammar, and we understand it. We learned it somewhere in school or however else, but we could as well speak in a different way if we had learned it, and we would agree on this. And also nothing in the rules of the grammar of English or in the vocabulary of English is kind of necessary, from first principles. It's just a convention. So how does this convention emerge? Naively, you might think, okay, so some wise elders sat together and hammered out the rules for the language. But then this begs the question, well, how did these wise elders actually communicate with each other if they didn't have English or any other natural language, and you get an infinite regress? So before people can agree on a code for communication, they already need a code for communication. And Lewis' point was, well, he didn't really give an answer to this question of the origin of conventions like language, but he said, well, if a convention is a Nash equilibrium, then it's self-reinforcing. So however we got there as a society, once we are there, we're going to stay there, because it's in everybody's interest to conform to the convention as long as everybody else does. In the meantime, then in the 1970s, people developed evolutionary game theory, and then this can also be applied to social processes. And there's a host of literature, both theoretical and simulation studies, showing that independent agents quite easily develop a common code. As soon as you have some random fluctuations, then, and if by chance the agents happen to agree on a certain aspect of a code, this code becomes self-reinforcing. So how we get into a Nash equilibrium is not so surprising as people might have thought 50 years ago. So this is one way how game theory is relevant for linguistics, but this is not what I was working on and what I'm going to talk about today, but I'm more interested in what happens in a specific situation when we interact via language. There was a philosopher of language, Paul Grice. I think he was in Berkeley, I'm actually not quite sure. And he posed the question, well, words have meanings and sentences have meanings, and there are rules how we can compute the meaning of a sentence when we know the words in the sentence and the grammatical rules. But what is actually being communicated is not exhausted by the literal meaning. So for instance, if somebody is standing by the side of the road outside his car, and somebody else stops and asks what's going on, and the first guy says, I'm out of patrol, and the second guy says, 200 meters down the road is a gas station. Then at the face of it, this seems to be disconnected, right? So the guy doesn't have patrol, and the other person doesn't comment on this lack of patrol, but speaks about a gas station. But because we are part of a culture, so everybody knows that gas stations sell petrol. 200 meters is short enough to go there walking or even pushing your car. And the guy who's out of patrol can actually infer that the other person thinks that a petrol station is open and that they sell petrol and these things. So from the assumption that people are willing to cooperate and are willing to be altruistic in this situation, a lot more information can be squeezed out of this dialogue than what is actually conventionally part of what is being spoken. And Grice was interested in how this discrepancy can be bridged. This is called pragmatics in linguistics. So semantics is concerned with the literal meaning of utterances, and pragmatics studies what is actually communicated. And Grice developed a framework of just sketching the logic of this going from meaning to interpretation. And this involves reasoning about the state of knowledge or belief of the other person, including the other person's reasoning about my own state of knowledge. So the typical game theoretic kind of recursive theory of mind reasoning. And what I'm doing here, what Michael is doing, is basically formalize this Gricean program in game theoretic terms to explain what's happening in one-shot interactions. This is, of course, also something economists are doing. And here's an example which you probably know. So this is taken from this book by Jäger, Behavioral Game Theory, which came out in 2003. The experiment or the setup, the game, is called the Beauty Contest. So this goes back to a statement by Maynard Keynes, I think, who said, well, in economic activity, it's not so important to do something you like, but to figure out what other people will like. So beauty is not just what you like, but what other people will like, and it's related to this. So the game is as follows. You have a group of participants. Each participant has to write down a number between 0 and 100. Then the game leader collects these numbers, and the person who is closest to 2/3 of the average of all numbers wins. Now, well, if you already know it, then it's boring, but if you don't know this, so what would you think? What would you do yourself, or what would you expect participants to do in such an experiment? Well, the Nash equilibrium would be everybody is picking 0. But this is not what people do. So here, so this is copied from this book by Jäger. This is the result of one of those experiments, and Jäger performed this experiment with all sorts of populations, from CEOs to undergraduates, and it seems only economics majors behave differently from normal people, because they know game theory, and so they will be able to compute the Nash equilibrium. But people without prior exposure to game theory, well, you will get a result something like this. So you get a peak at, what is this? So around 30. Then you get another peak here around 14. Then you get a few outliers. So whoever picked 100 obviously didn't understand the rules of the game. And yeah, you get a broad noisy distribution somewhere between 0 and 40, say. And how does this come about? One way to think about this is that you need something like a default model of what the other people are going to do. And if you don't make any assumptions about the other participants, then you can expect that, well, let's assume a uniform distribution, that people just pick a number between 0 and 100. The average of this will be 50. 2/3 of 50 is 33. So if I pick 33, I might have good chance of winning. So this would be somewhere here. But if everybody makes this reasoning, then you can expect that everybody will pick 33. And if you want to outsmart the others, then you should actually go to 22. And it seems like in this particular experiment, this is what most people did, at least the plurality. And if you assume that all co-participants are capable of doing this level of reasoning, then you should actually go to 14, and then you should go to 11, etc. So what the optimal choice is here actually depends on how much rationality you ascribe to the co-agents. And classical game theory assumes that all agents are perfectly rational, and they assume about each other that everybody is perfectly rational, etc. But this is not what real humans are like. But this is actually a side issue, this bounded rationality thing. So what I find appealing for linguistics is this general framework of starting with some dummy model of the other participants, the other agents, and then computing the best response and repeating this, computing the best response to the best response, and then perhaps the third level until you get a fixed point. And I believe that this goes a long way explaining how, how meaning actually emerges in communication. So formally, so this is couched as a signaling game. So this is the model which David Lewis invented in his 69 book, but I'm not sure whether it was reinvented. I think it was reinvented several times. So there's this Crawford Sobel paper, which is very influential, I understand, in economics. And there were other people sometimes going by the name of sender-receiver game. So this is a very natural way of modeling a one-shot conversation as a sequential or an extensive game. So first you have nature, which assigns a type. So you have two players, S and R, sender and receiver. The sender has a private type. So nature assigns a type to the sender. In linguistics, we like to speak about possible worlds. And a possible world is pretty much the same as what in game theory is being called a type. So nature assigns a type to the sender. And this is drawn at random according to some prior probability over types, P star. So the sender is aware of their type, and then the sender sends a signal to the receiver, so or a message, M. So there is a predefined fixed set of messages, and the sender chooses one of them, and the receiver observes the message, but not the type. And the receiver then chooses an action, A. And then we have a utility function for both players. The utility depends on the type of the sender, on the action of the receiver, and perhaps also on the message being sent. So here's a very simple instantiation of this game. So suppose that Sally is paying a visit to Robin, and Robin wants to know what kind of beverage to serve, tea or coffee. And so the common knowledge is that Sally either prefers tea or coffee. So these are the two types, and they both have a prior probability of 50%. Robin can serve either tea or coffee, so there are two possible actions. And the utility matrix is like this. So if Sally prefers tea, then she prefers being served tea, and Robin just wants to please his guests. So the interests are completely aligned. And then if Sally prefers coffee, then both prefer that she actually gets coffee. And then there are two messages, I prefer tea versus I prefer coffee. Both messages are costless, so the utility doesn't depend on it. And then we have an extensive game with incomplete information. So first nature assigns a type to Sally. She wants tea or she wants coffee. Then Sally can send a message. Robin observes the message, but not the type. So we have an information set here, and we have another information set here. And then Robin picks an action. And then we have utilities down here. And clearly there is a Nash equilibrium here, which is shown in black. So if Sally wants tea, then she can say, I want tea. And then Robin reacts with serving tea. And if Sally wants coffee, she picks the other message and Robin acts accordingly. So this seems simple, but there is a second Nash equilibrium when Sally always says the opposite of what she means, and Robin is aware of that. Right, so if Sally is always being ironic and Robin knows this, then communication also succeeds. And the question is, how do we pick an equilibrium? And here's where linguistics comes in, because in linguistics, well, messages have conventional meanings. And if you look at these two Nash equilibria, then here this one is in line with the conventional meaning of the messages, while this one is not in line with the conventional messages. And the basic intuition of my entire model is that agents in natural language conversation use the literal meaning, the conventional meaning of words as the default baseline. They may diverge from it, but only if they have an incentive to do so. So using messages according to the literal meaning is the default. And in this case, so this would single out this Nash equilibrium as the better one. So how can we spell this out? So how do we find this Nash equilibrium? And this is where this notion of an iterated best response comes in. So we have kind of a dummy model of a very naive sender, call it S0. And this dummy sender always sends a true message. And if there's more than one true message, so true according to the literal meaning of the message. So if there's more than one true message, then S0 just randomizes among all the possible true messages. Then R1, so a somewhat strategic receiver, will play a best response to S0, meaning inferring a posterior distribution over types of S0 and then choosing the action which maximizes R's utility given this posterior distribution over speaker types. And then a sophisticated sender might actually anticipate the receiver reasoning like this and will will pick their message in such a way that the expected utility is maximized given the assumption that the receiver plays according to R1. And then you can repeat this, and in all the examples which are relevant for so for the linguistics literature, you achieve a fixed point after 2 or 3 rounds, and then these are Nash equilibria. Conversely, we could also start with a naive listener. So a naive listener, R0, is one who simply believes what he is being said and then updates his belief about the type of the sender according to the literal meaning of the message, and then chooses the action with the highest expected utility. And the manipulative sender could assume that the receiver is naive and then pick the message not according to its literal meaning, but according to what manipulates the receiver in an effective way to maximize the sender's expected utility. And a sophisticated receiver might anticipate the sender to be manipulative in this way. And again, you can repeat this ad infinitum, but we usually reach a Nash equilibrium pretty fast. And there is actually, I'm not aware of any principled argument which of the two IBR sequences are to be preferred. So I'm gonna, and in most cases, actually both sequences of IBR end up in the same Nash equilibrium. So how can we relate this to more natural linguistics examples? So this is something which Michael worked out in detail in his dissertation from Amsterdam. So suppose we have an example sentence and we want to figure out, well, what is its pragmatic meaning? So we have to make a decision or use questionnaires or some other device to decide what other messages could the sender have been used. That's very essential for any kind of pragmatics. So it's always relevant, not just what has been said, but also what could have been said but wasn't said. So we have to decide about the set of possible messages, and we have to decide about what the decision problem actually is. In linguistics, this is being called the question under discussion. And then the types or the possible worlds are all the complete answers to the question under discussion. So Of course, the world is infinite, and there are infinitely many things to which you can learn, but to keep things manageable for the model, so I'm assuming there's always a finite set of possible types, and the receiver needs to figure out what the type of the sender is. And then we need an interpretation function, so the conventional meaning of messages. And again, I'm simplifying here. So let's say each message can be true or false in each type. All right, so we just have a binary function. Then we need a prior probability distribution function over possible types. And I'm always gonna assume this is a uniform distribution, as long as there is no good reason to diverge from this. And then we need a set of actions and utility function. So the question under discussion, so the set of possible types can actually be constructed from the set of alternative utterances. So perhaps I should jump to an example here to make this a bit more tangible. So suppose the alternative utterances we are considering are some boys came to the party, no boys came to the party, or all boys came to the party. Then the possible worlds or possible types are all consistent Boolean combinations of these messages. So some boys come to the party. If this is true, then no boys came to the party must be false, because these two sentences contradict each other according to the literal meaning. And all boys came to the party can be true or false. Let's suppose this is false. This is one possible world where some, but not all boys came to the party. So this is the notation here. So this would be this possible world. Then we have a possible world where the first, so here B would be true and the other two false. So this would be, no, if the first and the third are true, so this would be the situation where all boys came to the party, and then we have the possibility that no boys came to the party, so the first and the third sentence must be false. This would be this possible world, and these are all consistent combinations of sentences. So in this example, we have three possible worlds, and then the interpretation function says, well, some. So the sentence B is true if some boys came to the party and either all came or not all came, but at least some. No would be true only in this possible world, and all only in this possible world. So types are maximally consistent combinations of message alternatives, or of the meanings of message alternatives. And the utility function, again, I'm simplifying. I think this is actually a difference in culture I observed between practitioners of game theory in economics and in linguistics. So linguists are kind of naive and benevolent, and they believe that everybody is altruistic. So completely identical utility functions for both players, while economists are more interested in what happens if the interests diverge, which is probably closer to human nature. I'll return to this issue of the alignment of interests later in the talk, but for the time being, I assume that there's for each, so that I assume that the interest of the receiver is to figure out the type of the sender, and the interest, so there is a 1-1 web between types and actions, and actually both sender and receiver share an interest in communicating as precisely as possible the state of the sender to the receiver. And this gives me this diagonal matrix with worlds as rows and action as columns as the utility function. Yeah, and then I assume a uniform distribution as prior distribution over possible states. Okay, and these two slides, they just give the formal definition of how we can construct this kind of game from a set of messages with a conventional meaning. And now we can look at how this iterated best response sequence is being computed. And again, I'm skipping over the general rules and explain it with an example. So with this running example, and I think it will be simple enough for you to see what's going on. So I start with this naive honest sender, call it sigma 0. And now this is supposed to be a behavioral strategy for the sender. So I have for each type of the sender, I have a probability distribution over possible messages. All right, so I have 3 possible types. Knowledge states of the sender. Either the sender believes no boys came to the party, or she believes some but not all boys came, or she believes all boys came. And if she believes that no boys came, then saying no boys came to the party is the only true message. So this is what she is going to pick. If some but not all boys came, or she believes this, then among the possible messages, the second one is the only one which is true. So all probability mass goes here. And the interesting case is if she believes all boys came to the party, because then she has a choice between 2 true messages, namely some boys came or all boys came. And because she is not strategic, sigma 0, she will just randomize over all true messages. So this is the behavioral strategy of a naive sender. And the best response to this for a receiver, this is again a behavioral strategy. So it's a function which assigns each message, each possible observation of the receiver, a probability distribution over actions. And actions are isomorphic to types. So we get a probability distribution over types. And then the computation is very simple. So you basically flip the matrix, form the transpose, and then in each column, our row 1 picks the maximal element. And if there's more than one maximal element, he will pick a uniform distribution over the maximal elements. But here there's actually always a unique maximal element. So here already at the first level of best response, we get a 1-1 map between messages and types. And then the best response of the sender to this receiver strategy is again this diagonal matrix. So the maximal likelihood in this column is here in the first cell, here in the second, here in the third. So here we have a fixed point. So the best response to row 1 is sigma 2, and the best response to sigma 2 is row 1. So we have a Nash equilibrium, and this is what the model predicts people will do. So in linguistic terms, so the prediction is that word like some actually means at least 1 or at least 2. So there is some debate about this, but otherwise it leaves open whether or not all will possible individuals will be covered. But in a default context, this will be interpreted as some but not all. And this is something at least linguists agree on, pragmaticists, and also a lot of experimental studies have been done that this is also what naive language users how naive language users tend to interpret an expression like some boys came to the party. So that this means some but not all, because the sender could have said all if this is what she wanted to say. And this is exactly the kind of reasoning which this IBR model captures. Of course, if you have a different context, so if the question is, I don't know, so you are eligible for tax deduction, and do you have, oh no, this is a bad example. So if if you have to give a lecture, if at least one student shows up, and if nobody shows up, you can cancel it, of course. And then afterwards, somebody asks you, well, how was the lecture? Did you have to give it? And if you say, well, somebody showed up, then it doesn't matter whether everybody showed up, because the question in the discussion then is, did somebody show up or did nobody show up? Then we have a different set of alternative messages, and then the entire model is different. Okay, so that's basically the model. Now I'm going through a few refinements. So far as the model goes so far, the implicit assumption is that Sally, so the sender, has complete knowledge about the decision problem at hand, but this is not, so this is called the competence assumption in linguistic pragmatics. So the assumption that the sender is completely competent, but this is not always the case, of course. So let's look at this example here. If we have the question, who showed up to the party or to the lecture or whatever, and then possible alternative utterances are N or bird showed up, N showed up, bird showed up, and N and bird showed up. So we have the two Boolean connectives here, and you probably heard some introduction into logic, and there's always this discussion, what does or actually mean? Is it the exclusive or the inclusive or? And one of the motivations for Grice was actually to say, well, literally, the inclusive or is correct, but pragmatically, this is often being strengthened to the exclusive or. What does the IBR model predict here? If we assume that sender is entirely competent, then there are three possible types, namely sender believes that only N showed up, the sender believes that only bird showed up, and the sender believes that both showed up. We don't have to consider the scenario where nobody showed up, because all possible messages entail that at least somebody showed up. And then again, we have identical interests between sender and receiver. Now, if the sender believes that N showed up and nobody else, then the first two messages are true. So the behavioral strategy of the naive sender will be a uniform distribution over these two messages. Symmetrically, if Sally believes that only bird showed up, then she could say bird showed up or N or bird showed up. And if both showed up, then actually all four messages would be true. So we get a uniform distribution. And then a posteriori, upon observing or, we will have this probability distribution for the receiver. And so the maximum likelihood choice would be either the first or the second possible world. So, and the third option actually is not, it doesn't give the maximal expected utility. So no probability mass is assigned to it. Then here we have a clear winner. Maximum likelihood choice would be the first, here the second, and here the fourth. So this would be the best response to sigma 0. And the best response for the sender to row 1 would be, well, here we have a 1, here we have a 1, here we have a 1. And here we get an odd prediction, because here in sigma 2, Sally would actually never use or. And upon thinking a bit, this is actually a perfectly reasonable prediction, because there's always a more specific alternative, and the sender has an interest in being as specific as possible. This is baked into the utility function. So there's never a good reason to use a vague expression like or if you can be more specific. And then I have to refine the notion of best response to deal with such zero columns. So a priori, So if Sally at level 3 assumes, no, if Robin at level 3 assumes Sally never to use or, but he observes or nevertheless, then he has to revise his beliefs. And then I assume the receiver will fall back on the literal meaning of this message. So if here we have only 0, then row 3 will look at sigma 0 and work with this column instead. Oh no, well actually, well, there are different possibilities. I assume just a uniform distribution over the literal meaning. But in any event, this sequence will predict or never to be used. And this actually makes sense because we use, if you want to be informative, and we use an expression like "and or bird showed up," then the only justification for this, if you're being perfectly honest and cooperative, is that actually the sender doesn't know which one is true. So we have to give up the assumption that the sender knows the truth. So we have to model types of the sender actually as underspecified knowledge states, as sets of possible words. So again, a lot of technical definitions, but let's just look at the example. So in this so-called lifted game, this is Michael Franke's terminology. The idea is that if you have 3 possible states of affairs, which are interesting in a specific game, then we have actually 7 possible knowledge states. So 2 to the power of the number of possible worlds minus 1. So the sender could have complete knowledge. These are the first 3 information states, but the sender could also have partial knowledge. So this would be the state where the sender knows that one of the 2 showed up, but doesn't know which one. Here, the sender knows that N showed up, but doesn't know about bird. Here, bird showed up, but it's unclear whether N showed up. And here, all the Sally knows is that somebody showed up, right? And then a message is true in an information state if it's true in all possible worlds in this information state. And if we use this type space, then we get reasonable predictions actually. But one more caveat, but I come to that. So now the naive sender would, well, the first 3 rows are the same as previously, but then we have the 4 incomplete information states. And then the rule is still everything which is supported by the information state is a possible utterance. Here, if the sender doesn't know which one came, then or is the only message she has complete confidence in. If she knows that N came but doesn't know about Bob, then the first 2 messages would be true. Here, the second 2 messages would be true. And if the Sally doesn't know anything except that somebody came, then or is the only possible or only honest message. And now the best response to this. So upon observing or, Robin, the receiver, wants to find the maximum likelihood estimate. So to get the maximum expected utility, and the maximum likelihood explanations for the observation would be either this state or this state. And then I assume, or Michael assumed, I adopted this idea that then there's a tiebreaker, nominal costs, which prefer more specific messages. So as receiver, I assume that the sender is competent unless I have evidence to the contrary. So if these 2 information states are possible explanations for my observation, then I will assume the more specific one. And then this is implemented with nominal costs. And then the prediction for the best response for the receiver upon this naive honest sender would be if I observe or then, well, the sender doesn't know precisely who came. but the best explanation, assuming the sender is as competent, as consistent with his behavior or with her behavior, would be the sender knows that one of the two came, but doesn't know which one. And for the message N came, then the best explanation is, well, the sender believes that N and nobody else came. The same for B. So Bird came, and for and, well, we have the literal interpretation. And here we have a 1-1 map, right? We only have ones and zeros in this matrix. So here we have a Nash equilibrium. The best response for the sender, 2 row 1, would be, well, to always, well, if, so if the sender knows N came and she isn't certain about Bird. Now, if the sender knows that N came, then this is what she should say. The same for Bird or for both. If the sender has partial knowledge, well, then if or would be true, then this is or is the only true description of the state, and this is what she's gonna say. And in these two states, then there are always two optimal messages, and if the sender doesn't know anything at all, well, then using or is the only honest option. And the best response to this is again this state. So we have a Nash equilibrium, and then this is a Nash equilibrium where or is being interpreted as N or Bird, but not both. So as the exclusive or. And N came is interpreted as N came, but nobody else. So as only N came. And again, this is something which is experimentally confirmed, the strengthening of the literal meaning. So if you have a single name, then this is strengthened to X, but nobody else, and or is being strengthened to the exclusive or. We can actually push this a bit further. So this is something, it's in the construction about which a lot of ink has been spilled by linguists. You could say something like N or Bird or both showed up. And this seems to be totally redundant, right? So if you have N or Bird, and if you assume an inclusive meaning of the disjunction, then this or both doesn't say anything which isn't already part of the meaning of the first disjunct. So this should actually be odd. And usually if you have a disjunction where the one disjunct is logically entailed by the other disjunct, this is odd. So if you say Bill is in Greece or in Europe, then, well, this seems to indicate that Greece is not part of Europe. But if we all know that Greece is part of Europe, so this is an odd expression, right? So why is 2a not odd? Well, in this setup, and now I need another refinement, I have to assume that the speaker prefers shorter over longer messages, everything else being equal. But this, again, is only a tiebreaker. So the speaker prefers to be as truthful and informative as possible. And if she still has a choice, then she prefers to achieve this with as little effort as possible. So if we add this possible meaning to the previous game, then we get, so now we have 7 forms and 7 information states. And now going through the IBR sequence, so this is the honest sender. So she always, basically in each information state, saying A or B or both, it means the same as A or B, right? So this column, this column for or and the column for A or B or both are exactly identical because they have the same meaning. Now, best response to this, Again, or and A or B or both are identical because they behave, well, they mean the same thing, but now the symmetry is being broken at a second best response level. So the best response for Sally to this receiver strategy would be so let's say we are in this state here. So Sally is in this state. Then she could say or she could say A or B or both, and then A or B is shorter, and then we have the tiebreaker. So if in doubt, then the sender prefers a shorter message over a longer one. So all probability mass will go here, and the same happens here. And then at this level, the prediction is actually that this message and this message and this message is never being used, so has 0 prior probability. So the best response to this would be to say, okay, I didn't expect this message to be used at all. I don't have an explanation. If I assume that the sender plays according to the strategy, so I simply assume, well, the message must be true, and I don't know more. So I have uniform distribution here, and here I have also uniform distributions over all information states where the messages are being true. But now we are not at a fixed point yet. So at the best response of the sender to this receiver strategy, then the best message to use if you're in a state of complete ignorance here is to use this very long and redundant message, because using or would be interpreted as A or B, but not both. So if you really want to communicate A or B or both, you really have to go the entire length and use this very long message. And if you're in a state where you know that A came, but you're not sure whether B came, then, well, you could say A or B or both, or you could say A or both. But the chance of getting your meaning across is higher by using this somewhat shorter message, and the same here. So now here on the third level of best response, we now have a 1-1 map between types and messages, and this is now a Nash equilibrium. So the prediction now is that N or bird or both showed up is being interpreted as the sender doesn't know which one. So we have not just, so we get the inclusive or reading, while for just N or bird, the prediction is that the exclusive or is being inferred, so N or bird, but not both. And for N or both showed up, this is being interpreted as N showed up and perhaps bird, speaker doesn't know. While just N without the or is being strengthened to N, but not bird. And well, at least 10 years ago, when we developed this model, so this was something like the consensus among linguists, among pragmaticists, about how these sentences are to be interpreted. In the last 10 to 15 years, there has been an awful lot of experimental research. Linguistics is actually in a transition, and I think economics went through the same transition over the last 10 years from a more rationalistic endeavor where you sit in your armchair and you think about how language should work, and you use your introspection, and then you construct models towards a very empiricist enterprise. So we now collect data and try to make sense of this. So there have been a lot of experimental studies investigating how people really react to such sentences, or looking at large corpora of text and figuring out how people actually use it. And so the bottom line in 2023 is things are much more complex than we think. So it's not a yes-no thing. So it's not that N or Bird or both showed up will be interpreted as the sender definitely doesn't know, or that N showed up is interpreted as Bird definitely didn't show up. But we have probabilistic preferences, but these probabilistic preferences are pretty much consistent with this categorical model. And this IBR model, this has actually been, now I'm jumping ahead, I have a few more examples, which I don't have time for now, but what people do nowadays is, and I think this was actually inspired by behavioral economics, by assuming that, well, real agents don't play best response, but something like quantal response. So they play something like a softmax response to expected utilities. So they are more likely to play a better response. So to play a response which gets them a high utility rather than a low utility, but there's some noise. And we can parameterize such a decision protocol by some parameter which models the degree of rationality. So there are completely irrational agents who just do whatever is handy. Or so this would mean if lambda is 0, then we just have a uniform distribution. If you assume a higher level of lambda, then people are more likely to optimize, but there's still some chance for error. And also you can parameterize, and this harks back to this game from the beginning with the beauty contest. So you have to make assumptions about how rational the other players are, and you can also model this with the parameters. You assume, well, I assume that that my audience is dim-witted, then I could use such a probability distribution over the level of theory of mind reasoning which your partner in the game deploys. Or you could assume, okay, so they are probably pretty smart, so I assume something like this blue curve. And this depends on the situation. In diplomacy, we probably have a very high level of iterated best response reasonings, and every tiny little aspect of a statement will be investigated. If you do banter or small talk, you are probably closer to this black curve, where not much depends on what could possibly have being interpreted into a message. And there's a lot of research going on actually using Bayesian inference to fit these parameters from actual data. And yeah, it's a very exciting line of research, but I'm not really part of this myself, so I can't talk about this. And what I just presented, so what Michael Franke and me did 10, 15 years ago, it was a bit one of the predecessors of this more realistic varying of modeling and experimental research, which is currently going on. Okay, thanks. And I'm looking forward to your questions.